The sun had barely risen over Willow Creek when Pastor Elijah Stone unlocked the chapel doors for morning prayer. He was a tall man in his 60s, calm-eyed and deliberate in every motion. With a past few in the neighborhood knew much about, the white-painted wooden chapel wasn't just a house of worship, it was a refuge, a place where lost souls, grieving families, and curious teenagers had found unexpected peace. But that morning, something didn't feel right. Ash floated in the air like snowflakes from a cursed sky. Elijah's boot crunched on glass as he stepped inside. What greeted him wasn't holy silence, it was blackened pews, charred beams, and the acrid stench of spite. The chapel had been burned, deliberately, and whoever did it had known exactly what they were doing. As he stared at the scorched cross that used to hang above the pulpit, Elijah didn't call 911 first. He made one call and one only. "Marshall," he said into the phone, his voice as cold as steel. "It's time." Across the neighborhood, in a sleek brick house with symmetrical hedges, Karen Duvall adjusted her sun hat and smiled at herself. In the mirror, HOA president, property crusader, and queen of complaints, she had finally done it. That chapel, she had said again and again, was a nuisance and non-compliant. She'd sent letters, filed forms, made noise. But when the forms failed and the board stayed silent, Karen claimed she'd had enough. What no one expected was that she'd take matters into her own hands using gasoline and a lighter like some twisted vigilante. She thought she was untouchable, that the law was her toy. She had no idea she'd just reignited the fire inside. A man who once sentenced cartel lords and corrupt CEOs, because Pastor Elijah Stone wasn't just a pastor. He was once Judge Elijah Stone, retired. Yes, but forgotten. Not even close. Karen's smug stroll to the HOA clubhouse was interrupted by sirens, not fire trucks, not police cruisers. Two federal black Suburbans rolled in like wolves among sheep. A few neighbors stepped outside, whispering, shielding their eyes from the sun and from the sight of Karen being calmly escorted from her rose-covered yard by two plainclothes agents. "Ma'am, you're coming with us," one of them said. "For what?" she scoffed, grabbing her sunglasses. "I pay my dues." The agent didn't respond. He simply handed her a folded document sealed and signed by someone with a very familiar name. Karen's face fell as she read it. The signature, Elijah M. Stone, issued under a dormant but still legally active federal emergency. Judicial clause. That chapel wasn't just private property. It had federal protection, something Karen never bothered to research because she never imagined she'd be up against someone with decades of legal artillery under his belt. Later that day, Elijah sat quietly in his rebuilt study, a single photo of his late wife on the desk beside him. He looked at the burned remains of the chapel through the window, but he wasn't mourning anymore. He was planning. "Justice," he whispered, "not revenge." His phone buzzed. It was Marshall again. "She's not taking this seriously," Marshall said. "She thinks you're bluffing." "I'm not." "You ready to wear the robe again?" Elijah's eyes narrowed. "I never took it off." Karen had never been inside a federal courtroom before, not as a guest, and certainly not as the accused. But here she was, in heels too tight and confidence that cracked with every step. She adjusted her blazer as if it would somehow rewrite the past 2 weeks. The moment she'd been pulled from her yard like a bag of trash, neighbors whispering, behind hedges, had haunted her ever since. She still thought she had time to spin the narrative. She always had. She'd written apology drafts, printed out permits from years ago, even told the HOA board she was being targeted by a disgruntled old man. She'd expected maybe a slap on the wrist, a fine, maybe even a public scolding. At most, what she didn't expect was the courtroom itself, lined with oak, echoing with federal silence, and packed with unfamiliar faces, including one that made her stomach twist. Elijah. He sat not behind a lawyer's bench, but at the judge's table, robe and all. Karen stopped walking. "No, this can't be real," she muttered. "He's a pastor." The bailiff called order. "This emergency hearing is now in session. Presiding federal judge Elijah Stone, acting under reactivation clause 31B, authorized by federal counsel." Whispers broke out like gas leaks across the room. Karen's mouth went dry. Her attorney, a local real estate guy who mostly handled boundary disputes, leaned over. "Did you know he used to be a judge?" Karen shook her head. He runs a church. He also ran half the East Coast courtrooms during the Clinton years." The man whispered. "You're in way deeper than you told me." Elijah looked calm. Not vengeful, not angry, steady. The kind of steady that unnerves even the most seasoned criminals. And while he technically wasn't prosecuting her, he'd been cleared to preside. In Karen's case, it wasn't civil anymore. Federal arson, hate-based property destruction, interference with protected religious infrastructure, 3 felonies. All because she wanted her view back. As the hearing began, the courtroom settled into tense silence. Karen's attorney fumbled his opening remarks, citing neighborhood disputes and emotional stress. He painted Karen as frustrated and provoked by Elijah's refusal to move the chapel, calling it a code-violating structure built for vanity. Then came the video. A neighbor's Ring camera capturing Karen sneaking toward the chapel with a red canister, her face, her footsteps, striking the match. Karen froze. I touched Nami. That could be anybody, she whispered. But the footage didn't lie. Elijah didn't speak until the very end of the day's session. He rose slowly, the courtroom watching his every move. I won't pretend I wasn't hurt, he began. Beth Chapel was where I baptized my grandson, where I held funerals for young soldiers who didn't come home. But this hearing isn't about hurt feelings. He looked directly at Karen. It's about whether someone who leads an HOA, someone entrusted to protect the peace of a neighborhood, decided that personal spite was greater than federal law. Karen clenched her jaw. You can't sit there and judge me or biased. Elijah raised one brow. The only bias I have is toward truth. As court adjourned for the day, Karen stood up and stumbled, catching herself on the railing. Reporters had gathered outside. Microphones, cameras, neighbors. Some watched with grim faces, others with satisfaction. Just when she thought the day couldn't get worse, she saw someone she hadn't seen in years. Renee Mulligan, a woman. Karen had bullied off the HOA board 3 years ago, and she was holding a folder. Karen's face turned pale. Not Renee, not those documents. The second morning of the hearing began with gray skies and a courthouse full of quiet tension. Reporters gathered early. Some even brought lawn chairs. The community had started calling it the Chapel trial, but behind the name was something deeper and unraveling. Karen arrived, flanked by her new PR handler, who looked as uncomfortable as a vegan at a Texas barbecue. She wore sunglasses this time, trying to block out the cameras, but they didn't help her see what was coming, because already waiting inside was Renee Mulligan, sitting calmly in the witness box, holding a slim blue folder with a single gold sticker on the front, HOA Confidential. Karen's breath hitched. No, that was sealed. That was sealed. Her attorney looked over, confused. What's in that? Karen didn't answer. She was already sweating through her blazer. Judge Elijah Stone tapped the gavel. Let's proceed. Ms. Mulligan, you're under oath. What do you have to present to this court? Renee smiled politely. Just some truth the neighborhood's been denied for years, Your Honor. She opened the folder with calm precision, as if she'd rehearsed it. I served on the Willow Creek HOA board for 8 years. I resigned after discovering misappropriated funds, biased citations, and targeted harassment mostly toward Pastor Elijah and other non-conforming homeowners. Elijah leaned forward. The room went quiet. Even the bailiff tilted his head slightly. Renee continued. This folder contains internal emails, handwritten notes, and meeting minutes, most of them written by Karen Duvall herself, including one labeled, Elijah's Chapel must go fire hazard or not. It's ruining property value. Karen leaped up. That was a private draft. It wasn't meant. Sit down, Ms. Duvall, Elijah said firmly. You'll have your turn. The folder was passed to the bailiff, then to the judge's bench. One by one, the documents were displayed on the screen. HOA memos, some stamped, some scribbled with Karen's unmistakable handwriting. Renee wasn't done. She also proposed a vote to defund storm drain repairs and reroute HOA money into decorative neighborhood gates, none of which were ever built. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some neighbors looked at each other in stunned silence. Others looked furious. Karen's attorney tried to object, calling the material ancient and irrelevant. But Elijah waved it aside. This case is about intent, about behavior, and Ms. Mulligan's testimony directly addresses both. Karen slumped in her seat. Her foundation had cracked. And then it crumbled. When the court broke for lunch, Karen barely made it out of the building before a voice called after her. Karen, she turned. It was Bethany Klein, one of the elderly residents from 3 houses down. She looked small but carried herself like a retired sergeant. You evicted my nephew? Bethany said sharply. Over a basketball hoop. You threatened to fine me when I had my niece's wedding in our backyard? You told me God didn't belong in HOA bylaws. Well, guess what? Honey, he found his way here anyway. She walked off before Karen could respond. Not that she had words left. Inside the courthouse cafeteria, Elijah sat quietly with a cup of black coffee and a sandwich he hadn't touched. Renee sat across from him. Do you think it's enough? She asked. Elijah looked up. She burned a chapel, Renee. But before that, she burned bridges. People just didn't speak up until now. Renee hesitated. There's one more thing. It's not in the folder. Elijah glanced up. She signed a waiver last year, voluntarily removed insurance coverage from communal properties, including structures like yours. She never filed it with the county. Elijah's eyes narrowed. So, when she burned it, she thought no one would care. She made it uninsurable, Renee whispered. On purpose. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever. Even the gallery's overflow chairs were filled with neighbors, export members, and a few unfamiliar faces scribbling in notepads. It was no longer just the chapel case. It had become a reckoning that now threatened to expose everything Karen Duvall had built her image on. Karen sat rigid, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her lawyer whispered updates, but she barely heard him. Her eyes were locked on Elijah. He hadn't flinched once. Not during the folder reveal. Not when Bethany Klein stood in the back of the room and silently mouthed, "We see you now." She wanted this over, but the next witness would make sure it was just beginning. Your Honor, the court clerk announced. The prosecution calls David Torres. Karen stiffened. No, it couldn't be him. The back doors opened and, sure enough, David Torres entered the room, his steps calm, his face unreadable. Karen's throat tightened. He was the chapel's former groundskeeper, a quiet man, always polite, always invisible. She'd fired him 6 months ago for excessive friendliness with residents. In truth, she'd told the board he was lingering too long near homes, and made sure his paycheck disappeared before the board could even vote. But now, he was back, and not for landscaping. David took the stand and was sworn in. Mr. Torres, the federal prosecutor began, can you describe what you saw on the night of the chapel fire? David nodded slowly. I was working late. I do weekend repairs for the Goodwater Senior Center now. I stopped by the chapel to check on some old gardening tools Pastor Elijah let me store there. He paused. I saw a woman sneaking around the rear entrance, holding something metal and red. I didn't want to assume, so I stayed quiet. But then I saw her pour something on the walls. Did you recognize her? David looked straight at Karen. I did. It was her. The room went cold. Karen's lawyer jumped up. Objection, no clear visibility was established. My client was, never I recorded it, David added calmly. The prosecutor blinked. You recorded it. David reached into a brown envelope and held up a USB drive. Didn't know if it was worth anything back then. I was scared, but after what she did to me, it didn't feel right staying quiet. Karen's hands shook. She gripped the table, so hard her nail cracked. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the video played. It wasn't a clear face shot, but the voice. Crystal. Karen's unmistakable tone floated through the speakers. I'll have my view back if I have to light the whole thing up. One little spark and this whole thing's gone. HOA said nothing, so now I'm fixing it myself. The gavel banged immediately. Court will reassess for 1 hour, Elijah announced, but the damage had already been done. Outside the courthouse, reporters flooded the lawn. People murmured, speculated. HOA members who had once backed Karen were now nervously dodging questions. Back in the courtroom hallway, Karen leaned on the wall, her eyes wide with panic. Her attorney was on the phone frantic, whispering something about plea deals. She spotted David nearby and stormed toward him. Why, didn't you come to me first? She hissed. Why would you go public? David looked at her calmly. Burned my workplace. You ruined my reputation. You cost me my apartment. And for what? So you could have a better view of the pond. She scoffed. You're not a victim. No, David said, but you're about to be held accountable. Upstairs, Elijah sat in his chambers, reviewing the video frame by frame. He didn't look satisfied. He looked exhausted. Marshall, his old clerk and friend, leaned against the doorway. You sure you can finish this trial? He asked. I didn't reopen my robe for revenge, Elijah replied. But justice? That's something I'll carry. To my last breath, Marshall hesitated. There's a reporter digging into Karen's finances. I think she was siphoning HOA money. Elijah looked up. Then this isn't just arson, it's fraud. It started with a single spreadsheet. On the third morning of the hearing, the prosecution introduced someone no one had seen before, quiet woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a laptop tucked under her arm. Her name was Ruth Delaney, and while she didn't look like much, the moment she took the stand, the entire mood in the courtroom shifted. Ms. Delaney, the prosecutor began, please state your role in this case. I'm a forensic accountant, she said, her voice calm and exact. Contracted by the state to review the Willow Creek HOA's financial transactions over the past 5 years. Karen sat up straighter. Her lawyer visibly paled. In the course of your investigation, the prosecutor continued, did you find anything unusual? Ruth adjusted her glasses. Unusual would be putting it mildly. A hush fell over the room. I discovered multiple instances of unauthorized withdrawals from the HOA's General Improvement Fund, over $94,000 total, siphoned over the course of 3 fiscal years. Do you have evidence to support these findings? Yes, Ruth replied, turning her laptop toward the screen. The projector flickered on, displaying line after line of transaction records. Withdrawals masked under vague labels like maintenance, emergency landscaping, and equipment replacement, all tied to one signatory, Karen Duval. Karen's jaw tightened. Those were all approved. They went through board vote actually. Ruth interrupted. Many of these transactions were made using your sole login credentials. No corresponding vote records exist. Karen's lawyer stood quickly. Objection. This is character assassination. The trial is about arson, not financial management. The judge leaned forward. Ms. Duval, you claimed the chapel was a financial burden to the HOA, correct? Karen nodded, eyes darting. You filed reports stating it cost the community thousands in lost property value. Yes, she said firmly. Because it did, Ruth chimed in. According to real estate data I pulled, property values in Willow Creek actually rose 8% during the chapel's presence. In fact, several listings included proximity to the chapel as a selling point. Karen blinked. That's wrong. You're skewing the data. I'm just reading the numbers, Ruth said evenly. That then came the final blow. In addition, Ruth said, clicking to the last slide, I found a secondary bank account set up under a shell LLC called W Creek Green Group, the registered owner. Karen Duvall. The screen lit up with transfer records. Funds from the H-Wall's maintenance budget flowed directly into that account over a 2-year period. From there they were used for high-end purchases, home renovations, travel expenses, and even a down payment on a new car. Karen's breath caught. That account isn't bank records show your name, social, and IP address used to manage the account, Ruth stated calmly. Elijah glanced over the documents. His voice was steady, but cold. Ms. Duvall, you may want to consult with your attorney. At this point, we are no longer dealing with a single act of arson. We are potentially looking at federal fraud, embezzlement, and wire fraud charges. Karen's lawyer leaned toward her, whispering rapidly, but she didn't hear any of it. Her world was collapsing in slow motion. She glanced back at the audience. Not a single friendly face. Even her most loyal supporters, the ones who'd once praised her lawn rules, her visionary policies, were now staring at her like a stranger. Some had their phones out, recording. Others looked ashamed. And near the back, Pastor Elijah sat motionless, his hands folded, eyes unwavering. She'd tried to erase his chapel from existence, but now it was her reputation that had gone up and smoked out as the court recessed for the afternoon. Elijah made his way toward the exit. Reporters trailed him with questions, but he paused only when he saw Marshall standing by the stairwell. They're going to charge her, aren't they? Elijah asked. Marshall nodded. The DA's watching from the overflow room. They're prepping paperwork now. Elijah exhaled slowly. It's not joy, I feel. Just ... closure. For the chapel, for what she took from this community. She took a lot, Marshall said. But she gave us something too. Elijah raised a brow. A united front, Marshall added. They're not scared of her anymore. But as Elijah turned the corner, a young courier approached and handed him a sealed envelope. He opened it. Inside, a single photograph of Karen, standing in front of a private security office in another city, we stumped 2 days before the fire, and in her hand, a set of blueprints for a completely different building. Elijah stared at the photograph in his hands, like it had slapped him across the face. Karen Duvall, outside a private security firm in Wellington Hills, nearly an hour away, a manila folder under one arm, a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints in the other. The image was time-stamped exactly, 48 hours before the chapel fire. And on the back, in neat penmanship, someone had scrawled, "She didn't act alone." Back inside the courthouse, the trial resumed, with tension thick in the air. Karen no longer looked defiant. She looked cornered. Her lawyer hadn't said a word since the recess, and the gallery was buzzing over the financial revelations from earlier. But Elijah's mind was elsewhere now. He passed the photo quietly to Marshall in the hallway before the next session. "Find out who took this," Elijah whispered. "And fast." Marshall nodded and walked off, already dialing a contact. When Elijah returned to the bench, the room settled as if it sensed something new had entered the game. The prosecutor stood and cleared her throat. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to submit new evidence suggesting motive beyond what's already been discussed." Karen's eyes darted between her attorney and the screen as a high-resolution scan of a land development blueprint appeared. At the top, it read, "Proposed construction, Wellington Heights Country Retreat, Phase 1. And right in the middle of the design, a luxury spa and resort, built exactly where the chapel had stood, according to documents pulled from Wellington Hills Zoning Commission. The prosecutor explained, Ms. Duvall had filed a private partnership application with a firm called Linmore Properties. The proposal claimed the neighborhood land, specifically the area surrounding the chapel, was open for development under unused green space codes. Elijah's brow furrowed. The chapel is protected and recorded in both county and federal historical registers. Yes, the prosecutor said, which is why it needed to disappear before permits could proceed. Karen stood up suddenly. That's not true. That spa wasn't real, it was just a pitch. The prosecutor nodded. A pitch you submitted, with your uncle land developer Brent Lintmore. A gasp echoed through the courtroom. Suddenly, it all made sense. Elijah remembered Brent. He'd lived 3 towns over and had tried to purchase the chapel's plot 15 years ago for a hotel project. The community had shut him down unanimously. Elijah had been the one to lead the opposition. And now here, he was again, just in Karen's shadow. Ruth Delaney, the forensic accountant, was called back to the stand briefly. I also found a large deposit, $25,000, made into Ms. Duvall's personal account shortly after her meeting at Wellington Hills, Ruth said. The sender, Linmore Holdings LLC. Karen's voice was trembling now. It was a retainer. For consultation, Elijah cut in. Ms. Duvall, consultation doesn't require torching a house of worship, and it certainly doesn't involve hiding development plans under a false address. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered furiously. Karen's hand trembled as she tried to pick up a glass of water. But Elijah wasn't done. There's more, isn't there? He said softly to the prosecutor. She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The spa project required a demolition certificate. That request was filed using a forged document, with your name signed at the bottom. Elijah's eyes narrowed. Mine? Yes, sir, and the signature doesn't match any of your legal documents. A printed copy of the forged form was shown on screen, even from her seat. Karen looked stunned and scared, because she had an authorized dot back in the clerk's office. Marshall got a call from his contact. You were right to flag this, the voice said. The security firm Karen visited. She was meeting someone there, a man named Wyatt Mercer, ex-HOA consultant, fired 3 years ago from another district for falsifying demolition permits. Marshall's heart pounded. Was he at the chapel the night it burned? There was a pause. No, but his truck was. And it left tire tracks that matched what was found near the back fence. Back in court, Elijah turned to the prosecution. Get a subpoena for Wyatt Mercer. Karen looked completely drained now, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. She whispered to her attorney, I never signed that form. I swear on my life I didn't sign it. But it was too late. The fire wasn't just hers anymore. Rain tapped against the courthouse windows as the trial resumed the following day. Outside, reporters stood under umbrellas, whispering that something big was coming. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. The air wasn't just heavy, it was volatile. Karen sat slouched in her chair. No more press-ready posture, no more tight-lipped glares. She looked hollow. Her lawyer barely spoke to her anymore, only shuffled papers like he wanted to be anywhere else. Then the back doors opened, and in walked Deputy Marshal Torres escorting a man in handcuffs. Wyatt Mercer, mid-40s, wiry frame, wearing a windbreaker with the hood pulled low. His wrists were chained in front, but he held his head high. Karen's mouth dropped open. No, she muttered. No, 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 no. What is he doing here? The courtroom fell into dead silence as Wyatt was led to the stand. Elijah's gavel struck once. This is an emergency witness session, Elijah said. Mr. Mercer has been taken into custody for questioning related to the events surrounding the chapel fire. Wyatt was sworn in. He looked around the courtroom, smirked once, and locked eyes with Karen. You going to pretend you don't know? Me now, he said flatly. Karen nearly fell out of her chair. The prosecutor wasted no time. Mr. Mercer, were you hired by Karen Duval to assist with demolition planning on a site in Willow Creek? Yep, Wyatt said casually. She told me she needed help clearing a structure that didn't have proper permits. Paid me in cash. Showed me a map with the chapel circled in red. Said it was blocking progress. Her words, didn't she instruct you to set the chapel on fire? Wyatt chuckled darkly. Nah, that was her idea. I offered to file a fake complaint and get it condemned, but she didn't want to wait. Said she was being suffocated by tradition. Karen shot to her feet. He's lying. He's bitter. Got fired from HOA Consulting for stealing. Sit down. Miss Duval, Elijah ordered. Wyatt shrugged. They fired me for cutting corners. Sure, but I've never torched anything. You wanted fire? That was all you. Then the twist dropped. The prosecutor leaned forward. Mr. Mercer, are you aware someone filed a demolition request using a forged version of Judge Stone's signature? Wyatt blinked. Someone forged his name. Yes. We traced the digital document back to your tablet. A beat of silence. Wyatt's smirk vanished. I never forged his name, he snapped. That wasn't me. Then who had access to your tablet? Wyatt hesitated. Only one person borrowed it. Karen said she needed to mock up a zoning file. Said she didn't trust her home computer. Karen turned ghost white. Elijah steepled his fingers. So not only did she authorize illegal payments, solicit a false consultant, and lie about the fire, she impersonated a federal judge. The courtroom exploded into murmurs. Karen backed into her chair, as if trying to disappear. Wyatt was let out shortly after. He hadn't saved himself, but he had confirmed everything Elijah suspected. During recess, Elijah walked alone through the courthouse hall. A few neighbors passed him quietly, nodding in respect. He found Marshall by the vending machine. You think it's enough now? Elijah asked. Marshall nodded. The DA's prepping a full rack of charges. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy. Name it, she pled. Elijah said. She has to. Marshall frowned. Maybe. But there's something you should know. He handed Elijah another photo just faxed in from Wellington Hills. It was Karen, at a coffee shop sitting with Brent Linmore, her uncle, and next to him, an HOA board member from Willow Creek. Marshall whispered. Karen wasn't alone on the board. Someone else pushed the paperwork through. Someone still sitting there. Elijah's jaw clenched. They tried to burn more than a chapel. They tried to burn the system. Back in the courtroom, Karen's lawyer leaned toward her. Offering you a deal? He whispered. Reduced sentence if you cooperate? She didn't respond. Karen, he said sharply, you'll go to federal prison, unless you start talking now. Karen sat motionless. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward Elijah on the bench. For the first time, her face showed something new, fear. Karen's fingers trembled as she picked up the pen. The deal had been laid in front of her. Limited sentencing, in exchange for full cooperation, and named co-con. It was either that, or face decades behind bars alone. She didn't care about saving face anymore. There was no face left to save. Not after Wyatt. Not after the forged signature. And not after the video played before a courtroom packed with the very neighbors she'd once ruled over, like a queen. Now she was just another defendant. Judge Elijah watched her from the bench, his eyes focused and unreadable. He wasn't seeking vengeance. That wasn't his way. But real justice wasn't finished yet. Not until the full truth came out. Karen's voice cracked as she spoke. I wasn't the only one. I didn't have access to certain documents. On my own, I had help. From inside the board, murmurs spread across the room like wildfire. The chapel was just the beginning, she went on. We were planning to clear the entire lot south of Oak Ridge Lane, all the HOA standard homes. The goal was to flatten it, make space for what my uncle called a private urban escape. Elijah's brow furrowed. Who helped you? Karen hesitated, then pointed at Greg Stanton, current vice president of the Willow Creek HOA, board seated quietly in the second row. Gasps exploded around the courtroom. Greg stood up. That's a lie. I had nothing to do with this. Karen narrowed her eyes. You signed the rezoning paperwork. You flagged the chapel as a non-essential religious structure. You told me Elijah was old and tired, that he'd never fight back. Greg tried to walk out, but 2 deputies were already blocking the doors. The courtroom descended into chaos. Neighbors were shouting. The HOA board chair, Mrs. Lutz, collapsed into her chair and covered her face with her hands. Greg was cuffed without resistance. He didn't say a word as he was led past Elijah, met his eyes with something colder than anger. Disappointment. Later that day, Elijah sat in his chambers, the gavel resting on the desk beside him. Marshall entered, holding a thin manila folder. Formal charges finalized, he said. Karen's getting 10 to 12, likely at FCI. Brian. Greg may face double that. Elijah nodded but didn't smile. Any more names? Marshall shook his head. That's all for now. Good, Elijah said. Let this town breathe again. The chapel was gone, but something better was rising in its place. 2 months later, a new structure stood at the heart of Willow Creek. Not a full church, not a courthouse, something simpler. The Willow House, a community hall built with the help of volunteers, many of whom had once silently obeyed Karen's rules. Now, they laid bricks, painted walls, and planted flowers in memory of what had been lost and what had been saved. At the dedication ceremony, Elijah stood before the crowd, wearing no robe, no collar, just jeans and a white shirt rolled to the elbows. He looked around at the crowd, some faces he knew, some new, David, Ruth, and even Bethany Klein. They had shown what the neighborhood really stood for. He cleared his throat. This place doesn't need stained glass or gold trim. It just needs people who are brave enough to protect what matters. The truth, the dignity of neighbors, and the belief that no matter how deep a fire burns, good people will rise from the ash. The crowd clapped. But just as he stepped off the small wooden stage, someone tapped his shoulder. A woman in a business suit. Judge Stone. She asked. I'm retired. He smiled. She held up a card. Not for long, I hope. The U.S. Attorney's Office would like to speak with you. About consulting on HOA ethics and federal oversight. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Sometimes, he said, burning something down is the only way to build something better. The fire started with spite, but it ended with truth, community, and redemption. If this story made you think twice about what really goes on behind HOA fences, stick around. We've got more stories that prove sometimes justice lives right next door.